One man writes that a number of years ago, his parents hosted a missionary family in their home, and one evening, the parents called their young son, in for supper. As he came in, the missionary mother said, "Don't forget to wash your hands." And the boy said, "Jesus and germs, Jesus and germs. That's all I ever hear, and I've never seen either of them." We live in a culture that does warn us against trusting. Don't give your personal information to anyone you're not sure of. Has anybody here got that call from the IRS? If it sounds too good to be true, what does the rest of it go? It probably is. Even life experience teaches us to be careful who we trust. There's a very old phrase, once burned, twice shy. When you've been burned, whether you put your hand on the stove or break up with someone you were deeply in love with, it's hard to trust again. When you feel like you've been burned by God, it's still hard to trust again. And that's exactly the place that Thomas was in this situation we read about this morning. Thomas, we don't hear a lot about except for this experience, but there was a scene much earlier that we get something of the flavor of what Thomas was like. Back when Jesus was in Jerusalem and he had a confrontation with the Pharisees and made the statement, "Before Abraham was, I am." And they were ready to stone him. Well, he left the premises, was on a mission trip north and east of Jerusalem up toward the place where John had been baptizing. He got word that their friend Lazarus was seriously ill. He waited. And then he said to the disciples, "We're going back down toward Jerusalem to Bethany where Lazarus lives." And they said, "Wait a minute, Jesus. The Pharisees were about to stone you. If they see you again, they'll carry it out. You really want to do this?" And he explained they needed to go there. It was the right time. Thomas said, "Let's also go and die with him." Thomas was committed to Jesus. He was as faithful to Jesus as a man could be. And perhaps that's the reason that his failure hit him so hard. He believed, he was willing to die for Jesus. When the time came, he found he couldn't do it. That failure resulted in Thomas first being disillusioned. "Jesus, we thought you were the one." And now he's dead? It's over. There's nothing left. "We thought you were the one." Along with his disillusionment, I think Thomas was severely disappointed with himself. He was just like the others. Even Peter, who claimed on that Last Supper evening, "Lord, I'm ready to die for you." And they all said the same thing. Thomas was right there with them. "I'm ready to die for you." And when push came to shove, he got shoved. So why was it that he was not with the other disciples that resurrection morning when Jesus showed up and showed himself to them? Why wasn't he there? Perhaps because he was in anguish and running away from the whole situation. Perhaps he should have been there. Perhaps when they got the word that the women had seen Jesus, they thought, let's go back to the upper room and try to sort this thing out. That's the last place we saw him. We'll see if we can figure out what's going on. Either Thomas didn't get word about it or he didn't buy it. Don't you people realize it's over? Maybe he should have been in that upper room, but he wasn't. It's hard for us to imagine, perhaps, what getting burned by God feels like. And yet anyone who has suffered, anyone who has experienced shame, anyone who's been afraid and not able to get over it, and we blame that on life experiences, life situations, but the fact is, those who trust Jesus have come to the place where life experiences, we know, have their root in what God wants to do in us. And when something happens that create these kind of reactions in us, it can be tough to trust. There are some other reasons why doubt can creep into life. There are some really, really tough questions about this Christian life. Things that sometimes, you read them in the Bible, but they don't make sense, they don't seem fair, they don't seem quite the way things ought to be. Tough questions. The actors Brad Pitt and Hugh Jackman both grew up in Christian homes. I didn't know that. At this point in their life, both those men have distanced themselves from the faith they grew up with. Brad Pitt describes his spiritual journey this way: I found my Christian upbringing very stifling. I always had a lot of questions about the world, even in kindergarten. A big question to me was fairness. If I had grown up in some other religion, would I get the same shot at heaven as Christians get? When I got untethered from the comfort of religion, it wasn't a loss of faith for me, it was a discovery of self. I had faith that I'm capable enough to handle any situation. There is peace in understanding that I have only one life here and now, and I am responsible. Hugh Jackman grew up in a deeply religious family, his parents having been converted by Billy Graham. But in a 2013 interview, Jackman said, I was involved with so many things in the church. It was my social group. It was where I went to meet girls. It was sort of my life out of school. And then around 16 or 17, I started asking the question, how come all these non-believers go to hell? Today, Hugh Jackman is not particularly religious and says he never prays, although he believes in some form of God in the afterlife and meditates twice a day for 30 minutes, mainly to quiet that part of the brain and just seeing and being. Tough questions can introduce doubt. Brief word of personal testimony. When I was 14 years old, I worked with an Abenaki Cheyenne Indian at a boys' camp in Maine. How I got there is an interesting story, but not germane to today. For the first time in my life, I was away from everything that was spiritually familiar. And as this man described to me what he called the Indian way, a way of living, a way of seeing the world, even though that way was strange to me, it felt more natural than the Christian life did. That was a point in my life that I was beginning to believe what a 5-year-old defined faith as. This 5-year-old said, faith is believing something you know is not true. Now, there are some problems with that definition, but at that point in my life, I was beginning to think there's a lot of stuff here I can't buy, and the Indian way seems a lot more natural. Now, there wasn't any real danger in my becoming an Indian. I had grown up a Christian, and my big motivation was, I don't want to go to hell. And if I abandon my faith, I'm liable to wind up there. So I was basically operating on fire insurance. But that experience was the first time I had encountered a real doubt in my faith. Tough place for a 14-year-old. Some doubts are rooted in those kinds of tough questions. Many other kinds of doubts are rooted in suffering and grief and shame and fear, especially when God does not live up to your expectations. The disillusion and disappointment in himself may explain why Thomas wasn't with the disciples on that first Sunday. And that leads to another question. If he is in this state, why did he come to the upper room on the next Sunday? They told him, we've seen him. And he said, guys, it's over. You want me to buy into this? You better give me something more to believe than just your word. I want to see that hole and I want to put my finger in it. I want to see that spear wound and I want to put my fist in it. Short of that, don't bother me. And in spite of that hurt and disillusionment, he came. They didn't know Jesus was going to show up. They thought maybe. And on that morning, they're gathered together in the upper room. And this was the most important thing. They were together. Thomas had been facing his disillusionment and his disappointment with himself and all the doubt that came with it by himself. And on this day that he would see what it was that would enable him to believe Jesus, this day he was together with some other people who cared about him. I think it must have been a bit of a shock, not only to see Jesus in the first place, but then when Jesus himself showed Thomas that hand and said, look, and put your finger here. Look, and put your fist here. Jesus, that's what I said to the disciples earlier this week. You know what I need. Jesus met Thomas exactly where he was and gave him what he needed in the company of others. Is it possible that when you're in the middle of that time that is so difficult and painful and disillusioning, and the doubts begin to creep, that the worst place to be is by yourself trying to figure this out? And the one place where you will find what you need to hang on and keep going is with others that you trust and who love you. When I was 14 and wrestling with all that doubt and wondering about the natural Indian way, I didn't realize it, but my family had begun attending a charismatic fellowship. And my mom got healed of a very serious back ailment that had troubled her for a long, long time. And when I came home and began attending and saw the same thing happen to someone else, it did an awful lot to bolster my faith. Jesus had stopped Thomas from going down a road that would lead him to absolute disillusionment and despair. And unlike Brad Pitt, who cast off his faith, Thomas found that pressing on helped him recover his faith. Thomas had been disillusioned. We thought you were the one. He had to change his understanding of what that meant. He is the one, but not what you expected, Thomas. He's greater, he's better than what you expected. He is not what you expected and not what you wanted, but he is what you need. If that time comes, and I might say when that time comes, that you have doubts about the hard questions. Why is this here? Ask the questions. Don't be afraid that God is going to send you to hell because you're asking hard questions. Lord, I don't get this. But come to it with a desire to understand, not with a desire to be rid of God. It is in wrestling with those hard questions that you begin to grow. And I would tell you that if you are hiding behind that statement, don't ask hard questions of God, you are depriving yourself of a way to grow. And when the crisis comes, you won't be ready. Those hard questions, the grief and the suffering, the disillusionment, the pain. Peter said there's a reason for these things, and we often don't see it. But no matter what it is, in 1 Peter, the apostle says, "Now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials." Anybody been there? These have come. And he gives the reason. Let me ask you for a second. What is the most valuable material thing that you have right now? Material thing. We've got some stuff at home that's worth something, and we've got some investments, and we've got some other stuff that's worth a lot. All of it, including all the stuff that you have, all of this put together, is not as valuable as your faith is. That's hard to remember when you're having a difficult time paying the bills. That's hard to remember when you're having a difficult time getting through this hard time. But Peter says your faith is the single most valuable thing that you possess. It's God's gift to you, and now you grow it. And he says, these hard things we go through have come so that our faith, of greater worth than even gold that perishes, even though refined by fire, your faith may be proved genuine and may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. And so to do what needs to be done to help each other. The writer of Hebrews says, "See to it, brothers, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God, but encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness." One of the things I have come to appreciate about this congregation so much is that when you see someone who's hurting, you go, "How can I help?" And sometimes there's something very tangible and concrete that you can do. And sometimes you just sit there and cry with them because it hurts and they don't know how to get through it. And one of the most wondrous things I have asked of me, I don't know what to say. At that very moment, it may be that there is nothing to be said. This person's heard all the words before. What they just need is someone to sit and feel with them, and if necessary, cry with them. In that moment, you become Jesus to them and help their faith hang on. One last illustration, and I'll be done. In his famous Screw Tape Letters, C.S. Lewis describes correspondence between a senior demon named Screw Tape and his nephew, a junior tempter named Wormwood, in the fine art of tempting a human being. Screw Tape refers to God as our enemy, and he says this: our cause, meaning the cause of hell, is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring but still intending to do our enemy's will, looks round upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished and asks why he has been forsaken and still obeys. The wounds, they weren't just in his crucified body. Those wounds are in Jesus' glorified body, and they will stand as a reminder that Jesus has been here and felt it, and a reminder of how very much he loves you no matter what you're going through. Pray with me.